Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from the Garforth Education, and this is the Right to Read initiative. I am very excited to have Jeremiah Short join me today, and we're going to focus on his journey as an educator to help understand what he does at the Phenomenal Student and how he got there. Hello, how are you?
I'm doing well. Looking forward to the interview.
Thanks. Me too. So let's start off with, where are you from? Where did you grow up?
Oh, well, that's kind of a two-part question in some ways. I'm actually originally from Brooksville, Mississippi. I grew up on a rock roads, one stoplight. Actually, the school that I went to, it's kind of weird. The school I went to up until the fourth grade, it actually was a school that was still technically segregated. So I actually didn't go to school with a child that was a different race until I was in fourth grade. So it's almost like I'm not saying my time was back in the 60s, but it was a lot of, I'm only 38. So just imagine this is the 90s. So that's kind of how I got my start. But then I ended up moving to Columbus, Mississippi, and I went to a school that was called the California Confederate. So I had a very interesting schooling background, so to speak, kind of one end to the other. So, and then I went to Mississippi State. So I'm a Bulldog. So those who aren't from Mississippi, that's what we're called Mississippi State Bulldogs.
Well, I'm sorry you experienced that. Unfortunately,
I'm fine. It's Bill's character.
Well, exactly. And even the most affluent public schools cause damage to their students. Even if you were at, the school in the city with the best teacher in the class, you can have damage, but it doesn't excuse any that might have been done to you. Mm-hmm. So when you finished school, what did you want to be?
Well, honestly, that's kind of part of my journey that I kind of probably didn't have a clear focus, but I did know I wanted to be in my major sports communication. So I knew I either wanted to do radio or be a writer or something. So mm-hmm. I actually started out working at the Commercial Dispatch, which is a newspaper, as my internship. I kind of started down that path. I ended up, that internship ran its course, and then I started doing sports radio and just doing a series of like odd jobs. And then I still would write and do things like that. So that kind of I was the typical struggling writer. So my journey was starting off, I wanted to be a writer or just be in sports in general. I still love sports, even though I don't spend as much time focusing on it as I used to now that I've become a teacher. But definitely, that's what I wanted to be. But obviously, my path ended up leading me to teaching.
Yeah. So you finish high school, you start on this, broadcasting, reporting career. Now, so my brother he was a sports announcer and a broadcaster, and he worked in radio, and now he's on TV as a news reporter. And I actually brought him into my classroom to help teach the kids about expression when I was trying to work on fluency with my students, because they were that deadpan, boring voice. My brother has that like announcer voice, and he knows how, because he worked at basketball games, he worked all the sports games as the announcer, right? So he has got the charm, the charisma. He must have been like, I don't know, 23 or something. And he's this big, tall guy, and all the kids were like so enthused about it, right? And just understanding how to get the attention of individuals from a broadcaster's perspective, from a sports writer's perspective, is different than someone who just went into teaching right off the bat. So what was your next step from this?
Well, again, I was a struggling writer. So, I went through the struggles of, not making a lot of money doing those things. And oddly enough, a friend of mine, a guy from my church, he worked at this behavior school. Mm-hmm. And he said, man, we always look for people, be a pair of. And I was like, well, I can go and do this for a little bit, maybe become a teacher, at that point, get my alternative certification and be a teacher. And that would give me something stable until I decide that I want to make the writing easier, because then I won't have to worry about the stress of money. I can write freely. That's kind of what was in my mind. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to go become a teacher. And actually, I was thinking of doing like high school math or something like that. I wasn't really taking teaching serious. It was just a job, to be honest with you. And then I started working at this behavior school. And then it really wasn't working at the behavior school because it was a behavior school. It was actually work with kids in the evening. And I worked with kids at my church. And then when I started working with kids in the evening time, I was like, the bug started catching me, I guess. I was like, man, I like working with kids. Like that kind of started catching me. And I was like, okay. And so toward the end of that year, I actually had a chance to cover the NCAA tournament for the second time, for second year in a row. So, okay, the writing thing was there because I eventually got offered a writing job. And after covering this NCAA tournament, it's like, hey, we need someone like you can come shake things up. And I was actually considered a pretty talented writer. Some people thought I could really be that type of good as a writer if I just chose that profession. And I told the guy, I was like, nah. And I was like, I want to teach. And I knew at that point I wanted to teach. And I was like, mind you, I'm a paraprofessional. So I'm making, although I worked in the evening, so I did okay money-wise, but you offered a chance to, one, this is what I want to do for years. And I actually worked at it, and I actually sent my stuff to national writers, and I really worked at it. But I knew at that point, teaching was what I wanted to do. And so I decided to become a teacher, and I actually didn't get a teaching job for another year because I had to go through the certification process. So I hadn't even started it yet, but I knew at that point I wanted to teach. So I hadn't even started the certification process, but I knew that's what I wanted to do.
Okay. So with these students at the behavior school that you're working with, what are you noticing?
Well, it was a special needs behavior school, so it's a little different. Most of the kids at our school were nonverbal, 80% were autistic, but it was a great training ground for me. One, the overall culture of the school was pretty good. I felt like a lot of people really put their hands around me and tried to develop me just overall because they knew I wanted to become a teacher, especially after my first year. So they really were, trying to develop me, just as an overall professional. But what I noticed with a lot of the kids, relationship building is still very key. The teacher that I worked under my second year, he was very big on building relationships. So it was still key, even though those kids, you're not communicating with them in the same way, it's still the same thing. And at a school like that, it's a bit more at a premium to develop a relationship, because if you don't have one and they don't like you or they get upset that day, it's not going to be they get mad or even simple as flip a desk or do something like that we think of in traditional schools. They might physically try to harm you. So it's almost at an umpteen power that you work on these other skills, preventative skills. So with kids there, relationship building was very key, knowing their triggers. So I would say if there's anything, and it translates into regular teaching, knowing their triggers and what sets them off, routine was very important. So of course, so all of it's kind of the same as what you would deal with at a traditional school, but at the same time, these kids have aggressive behaviors. So you're trying to keep them, in routine, because if they're not in routine, they might be aggressive. So you kind of want to do it a little more. It's not like a classroom just being loud. You're like, oh, they're disruptive. Like, no, they're a little more than disruptive. So it kind of forces you to almost do it a lot more. And in a school like that, as a paraprofessional, you are, and actually got paid more, you're at a higher premium because you, as they said at that school, you somewhat ran the classrooms too. So it wasn't just, you followed the teacher's lead. Sometimes the kids, and I feel like I said, it's still very applicable to the average school, they have certain teachers that they connect with. So the teacher might not be telling the kid to do stuff. It'll be the parent. So that's where you kind of learn about that. So you still learn about how you even deal with traditional gen ed kids, but at the same time, it's for different, their responses are going to be different, but it's going to be essentially, you get the same result. I feel it's just that they have more aggressive behavior, and your main focus is behavior, not 100% the academic aspect. You're trying to teach them certain life skills, but at the end of the day, behavior is still going to be the primary focus.
Right. Yeah. And, I think it's important to recognize or just mention that this is a school specifically for students with behavior issues and
yes.
special needs. So this isn't saying that all individuals with special needs or autism are violent or have.
Yes.
This is
it was essentially an alternative. Not essentially, it was an alternative school. It was an alternative school. So it would be for kids who are in those units that, the gen ed couldn't really handle. I mean, I work in a gen ed school, and I know, oddly enough, one of the students actually was at the school. One of the students who was at the school when I was there was actually at my current school when he was younger. But, sometimes they become a little hard to handle in the gen ed environment. They don't have the training that's necessary to handle kids sometimes with those issues. But like you said, it doesn't mean kids expect. And a lot of the kids there, it wouldn't be just that they're autistic. A lot of them had comorbidity. It was ADHD and bipolar. There's a lot of things that would be going on with those kids. So it wasn't just as simple as just they was typical aggressive in a traditional school. It normally was things that was attached to it.
Yeah. So this school is dealing with that, 1% to 2% of the population that our instruction is failing. And we recognize that the quote unquote traditional school isn't appropriate because their needs can't be met. at this point with how we do things.
Mm-hmm.
So then while you were doing your certification, what did that look like?
It's pretty simple. Honestly, I hate to put it that way, but I did Texas teachers, and essentially they're kind of like a facilitator for you to get your, take your test. I shouldn't say this out loud, but I took my SPED certification first. I actually have never officially pressed to actually get it, just for different reasons we can talk about out there. And then my core test, and then I'm trying to think if there was another one I had to take, but I know I took the core test. That was the main one I had to take, where I can get a probationary certificate. And then you get the probationary certificate, you have a year. Then you have to take what we call the PPR here, which is your professional responsibilities and all that. And that's would be the time when you would get your certification after completing that year. But you will have to observe a few people, do some modules. So I think they're actually going through a process where they're actually trying to make it more rigorous. And I actually had a coach my first year teaching outside of my typical school who came in and observed me teach and things like that. So he actually gave pretty good feedback.
Well, that's good. So did you have to do much coursework on how to teach students, reading, mathematics, that sort of thing?
No, honestly, I felt a lot of it was just I barely remember a lot of the stuff that was on those. And I think that goes with sometimes in a lot of these teacher preparation programs, not teaching people how to read. And when I stepped into a classroom, I didn't know anything. But at the same time, you kind of going in with a blank slate. So there's a lot of things you just don't know. So no, it wasn't a lot as far as like teaching you how to teach reading. Like I said, I didn't even know. I thought in the interview, I actually would be teaching writing. And then I get to my school and apparently I was going to be teaching everything. That was kind of a little bit of a shock. I didn't find that out until right before the school year. So not only I wasn't taught specifically to teach anything, it was like, hey, you'll be teaching everything. So.
Right. So your first year where you were in that probation, what did it feel like?
To step into a classroom?
Yeah.
I know I was telling my mentor teacher at the time, it was almost surreal. It was a couple times, like, man, I'm teaching. It was kind of like, it just felt weird because you're so used to, of course, like as a kid, more so like elementary or middle school, something like you see it on as a child, you don't know what's all going into what your teachers are doing. Like, you don't know why they did the things that they did. Now you're in a classroom, you're having to supervise 20, and sometimes some people have more kids than that, obviously sometimes less, 20 children, and then you have to actually teach them something. And you don't know what you're doing, how to manage a classroom, although I was the floor disciplinarian my first year, because the other side of coming from behavior school, they're going to give you the kids that are pretty tough. Because you have the temperament to deal with it, I guess, somewhat. I guess they think so, but, you're still trying to learn how to teach, but you got to deal with the toughest kids. So it wasn't the easiest thing to deal with. But at the same time, I was blessed to have a lot of those kids that I had, and a lot of them are doing quite well, which I'm sure we'll get to. But it was just very tough. Like I didn't know what I was doing. And so it was kind of, I'm somebody that wanted to know what they're doing, but I know the first semester, I completely did not know what I was doing. One of the things that really struck me, I remember at one point, 30% of my kids failed the test. And I mean, even at that time, I had a high expectation, and I didn't know what pass rates and things like that were. I didn't know much about what was considered good to that level, but I knew 30% wasn't good. And I almost cried, but we had a staff meeting, and I was like, well, I got to change something. So I remember my principal at the time, I was like, man, the kids just need to study, this, and this. And he was like, have you modeled studying? And I was like, no. And it was like, they're in fourth grade, they should be able to know how to study. And they were like, no. In fourth grade. And I know I talked to my sister at the time, and she said, you know how many teachers would have lost their, what, if the principal had said that to him? I was like, what? Because to me, I didn't get that. I always heard I could take feedback. Now, I always call it constructive criticism. There's a difference between that and just a person being nitpicky, I guess you would call it, or negative. But, I was always for taking constructive criticism. So, all right, going with that. I started to improve. After that, I started asking for help and things to do. And one of the things that kind of showed me how bad I was to begin with, one of my students showed me the notes I gave her for teaching area model, which is, I guess, what they do for multiplication here in Texas. I don't know how it is in other states. And I looked at it, I was like, what is that? I was like, I see why y'all couldn't pass nothing. It was kind of like that type of thing. And so but I did start to improve because my students that year, we were around the benchmarks. And one of the things that really got me, at that time, I've always been big on developing relationships and being very attentive to my students. So our principal came over the loudspeaker and he said the benchmarks were coming up essentially. I saw one of my students who wasn't that expressive kind of rolled her eyes and was kind of like, whatever, and kind of looked down. I was like, hey, why did you do that? And she said, those tests make me nervous. I was like, okay. And so my room was actually called the Greatness Room that year. So even backtracking a little bit, before I started the school year, I didn't know room, theme, all this stuff. I didn't know much about that. And this one lady I remember at the training, is probably the best thing that initially shaped my career. She said, just be yourself. And at that time, one of the things I was real big on was being great. So I'm like, hey, I'm going to call my room the Greatness Room. So I didn't realize that's such a big thing as far as teaching, being able to, as far as encouragement, motivation, things like that. So going to that, back to what I just stated, I told that student, like, hey, this is just another opportunity to show how great you are. And so that kind of started the whole thing. And I started making tests a really big deal. And so some people think I'm very performance driven, but that's kind of the origin of it. And so my classroom, we had around the benchmarks, we had a math, I think reading, then writing. I forgot which order the reading and writing were in, but we went from like the worst performing classroom on the floor to like the fourth best one. I was like, okay, let's go one step up and go third. And one of my students said, hey, why don't we go for first? I was like, all right. I was like, I don't know about all that, but okay. Not that I wasn't confident, but I wasn't. I was just like, they just so happened to go to first. They jumped up to first, I guess, on their floor, performance-wise compared to their peers, that particular, on that next test. And I think the next one, they were right there too. And so they took off after that. They actually were pretty much the highest performing classroom after that. They made a big jump and actually showed a pattern for a lot of my classrooms at that point. They typically start off kind of sluggish and then they jump. So that was kind of like, but I still didn't know how to teach it. Like, I'll be the first to say I didn't know how to teach. And so what really was a shift, I got a lot of good advice from my math coach and some of the other people in the building. A lot of them were great educators. But my literacy coach, shout her out again, Carol Dixon Hall now, was that Miss Dixon at the time. She, my kids actually was the high performing class in reading. And I was like, I just don't feel like they're growing up. It's just one day I was just like, I don't feel like they're growing. So I contacted her and I was just like, hey, can you come model a lesson? And it took about 2 or 3 weeks to get around to it. Maybe not that long, but she finally came in and modeled a lesson. And I was like, hey, that's what I want to be, because, I was following my teammate and it was just doing PowerPoints and it was pretty boring, to be honest with you. So I watched her teach and I was like, wow. Now at the time, I knew she was a high performer, but apparently she had the highest performance in the history of that district. Even at that time, she was only like 29, 28 years old, but she was the highest performing teacher in the history of that district. So I watched her and I was like, hey, that's what I want to be. Like that mode of teaching, just going teaching from the hip. And that's kind of was like really my origin as far as like really starting to take off as a teacher. Because after I saw her teach and I started kind of doing a lot of the things she was doing, that's when I kind of started defining my style, Mr. Short, Mr. High Energy, and putting that into my teaching. So that's where that kind of started it.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So you're teaching the fourth grade, you're making these improvements for the benchmarks. Mm-hmm. And you're making that difference because of the connection with the students.
Great.
Okay? And to me, it sounds like it's more than just a job to you. You're not just going in, clocking out. You're really invested. You're invested in your students. And it sounds like you're that teacher that they're all going to remember saying, you know what? Mr. Short made the difference. He did this year.
I already got an acknowledgement in the book. So yes.
Yeah. So I guess you're teaching this grade 4 class, you're making the difference, but recognizing you don't have all the skill in the background that you need. So where do you start looking to develop that, aside from having that teacher that did that lesson and you're like, wow, I need to do this?
Honestly, it's just one, being self-reflective, realizing that you don't have that skill set. But I was blessed. I always tell people, I did feel like I don't know if you're familiar with Dragon Ball Z. I felt like I went Super Saiyan because the people that I was around. I did have the pedigree, even though I don't have that typical teaching background. I have the pedigree. My sister's a really good ELA teacher, not good, great ELA teacher. Been ESL teacher of the year, been a literacy coach, ESL coordinator, dyslexia person, like teacher of the year, credentials through the wazoo. And then her best friend was the teacher of the year for the whole district. She's a dyslexia person, excellent ELA teacher, helped turn around the whole school. So those are two people that were like mentors as far as outside the school, as far as from the literacy perspective. So I had that. And then within the school, I had that literacy coach. And then, of course, I taught all subjects. So the math coach was excellent when she was in the classroom, 90%. The principal actually was a high performer. And I started noticing, I guess I'm seeing now, years later, my principal hired all high performers. So, even my assistant principal, Miss Bernicia Day, shout her out. She was very good to me that year, really kind of got me through that year. It was a very rough year. And she helped me with behavior. And one of the statements that stick out to me, and I told her that should be the title of a book when she writes one, is don't convict kids before they're guilty. Don't, like, as a course teacher, you're already making your mind that, kids are, that bad kid, because I had a kid that gave me a lot of trouble. So said, don't convict them before they're guilty. And so that was like one of the best things I ever, heard as far as a teacher. So that was kind of my background as far as building, started looking at videos was one of the things I was told, and just giving advice on my teaching. And so I started improving my practice. Now, I wasn't quite there. It was years away before I started really developing truly as a reading teacher to that level. But I started kind of developing the tentacles of being like a high performing teacher, because I knew how to kind of pull it out of kids. And then instructionally, I kind of started learning. The main thing was learning the structure. If I was to say anything skill wise, is learning the structure of a block and how to essentially, I wrote about how I became a structural literacy teacher, but part of that because I did do everything. So I learned to be very structured in everything that I was doing and being very database. So that was kind of what that initial skill developed, was that ability to motivate my overall skill level of being able to structure a block and just looking at data. So those are the things I think I excelled in to begin with. And then eventually I kind of got to where now where I can get to something I learned as far as with reading and getting kids to read. Oddly enough, it was a book at the time. I didn't know much about balanced literacy. It's a book called The Reading Zone that I read. And I didn't know much about all the theories and stuff like that. But one of the things they talked about was getting kids to be able to read and doing it by choice. And so that was one of the first things that I did. I was like, hey, I'm going to do it by choice and let them read whatever they want to read. And I don't think I leveled off too much my first year, but, I guess we kind of did that a little bit. So that was one of the first things I think I started doing from a reading teacher perspective. And I guess we'll get more into my philosophy tomorrow, but that was like one of the first things I did was probably, because that's what my room became, the phenomenal room. So, and the reason it became that, so I'm going to backtrack so I don't go too fast. Mm-hmm. My room was the greatness room. So the target goal was 90%. That's what we wanted to get them as pass rate. And I told them if they got to greatness, I would show them what phenomenal looked like, because we were supposed to look with our kids, which I did. And so it was the craziest thing this particular day. Definitely one of the days I remember in my career. I remember there was one student, she normally passed and she missed that day, which of course you want every kid that's there to be there on the test day. But that meant I had 20 kids there that day. So the target goal was 90%. So we took the test and I kind of started, I don't even know if I had looked at the scores yet. I don't know, the other people still taking the test, and I think we went to lunch or something. And so I sat down, I was sitting at my desk and the ESL coordinator was banging on the door. I'm like, hey, what's going on? I'm thinking something wrong. And then she was like, hey, you looked at your scores yet? I'm like, no. So I'm like nervous, like looking at them. I'm like, okay, look at them. And I started looking, because when you pass the test, they'll go, yes, no, yes, no. So I kept looking. I was like, hey, there's a bunch of yeses. Like, yes, 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 yes. And it was literally 90% on the dot pass rate for the test. So it was like, it was crazy. Like, my kids came back, we celebrated. There were people crying. It was literally that serious. And like, the thing was, my school was a low performing school. We were what we call a PEG school here. I don't know what they call them in other places, but that meant kids could transfer to other schools if they wanted to. So, it was such a transformational moment. And mind you, it was just a campus test, that people felt that kids were going to stay at the school, and some probably did because of that score, because it felt like it kind of gave us a little bit of kind of like hope that the performance is going up. And so that was that. It was a tremendous moment. Got a standing round of applause at the staff meeting. Like, apparently the literacy coach was breaking into meetings to tell everybody that I got 90% because it was like a really big deal. I was kind of one of her proteges. So it was like a really big deal. And so at the end of that year, I told the kids, hey, we're going to become the phenomenal room now. And so that's kind of where all this, the phenomenal student, all that kind of started.
And you know what? Having that teacher that believes in you and talks you up and says that you can do it is huge. Mm-hmm. Right? So, yeah.
How effect size too. So I interviewed someone over the weekend. That was one of the things we talked about was, and I didn't know much about the effect sizes then, or at all, but it's a big effect size.
Well, and also you're helping those students get out of the fixed mindset, right? And supporting them to go into that growth mindset. And not being from Texas or being in Texas, or I've never been there. But I'm assuming, like, you go into those lower performing schools that aren't known for their academics, and you see the students are just like, yeah, no, I'm stupid. I'm not going to learn anything. I'm not going to do well. And there's nothing that you can do or say that's going to make me think otherwise. And then you start building on those little successes and having success breed success. And having them recognized can really change their lives and the lives of individuals around them.
Yeah, it can. And the thing is, like again, the interview, odd enough, the interview I had on Saturday, we ended up kind of it was supposed to get into some other stuff. And we kind of I had a few other topics, but we kind of just started talking about kind of that commonality, because that particular person I interviewed, I saw him do a speech, and he had that 5th grade teacher that kind of was that person for him. And that's one of the major speeches that he does. And I kind of talked about, 2 students from that particular classroom. I looped with the same group of kids. And there's one student, I got him. He's actually a really good football player. I projected he's going to be in like the NFL. I really think he's going to be he's that type of good. And he was getting in trouble. He got kicked out of another school. And I still remember when he came the first day, his mom pulled him into the hallway. Now his mom's tall. She's like mine. He's on 5'11". She's like 6 foot tall. So I'm like, okay, big kid on top of that. So she was like, hey, he had some issues. I already knew what it was. I just know. Even at that point, I know what the rough ones. So she's like, I heard you were very strict, which I'm actually not. I'm actually not a strict teacher. My kids are pretty much still. People think I'm strict, but I'm really not. So anyway, I was like, okay, it's gonna be a little bit of a challenge. So I talked to him. This particular student, he kept telling me like, hey, I was in the bad kid class. I got wrote up a lot. I was in the bad kids class. I got wrote up a lot. So even before that, like the first day I got him, I still remember. And I knew I had something because we did a social studies assignment, which we actually did teach social studies in that school. That was literally our actual block of the schedule. He answered a question. It was very high level. I was like, like I said, my students weren't performing high at that point. I didn't have a lot of high performance. Hey, I think I might got something here. This kid's actually quite brilliant. He actually ended up being GT later on. Now, so I knew he was smart. So I was like, okay. And I tell him like, hey, just let that go. Let that old stuff go. Let it go. You're in the greatness room now. Let it go. Let it go. Let it go. And eventually he did. It took some time, but he became one of my leaders, became a high performer, ended up being like a straight A student. Ironically enough, his mom actually sent some type of email to the old school saying he had a male teacher or something now, and he's excelling and all this stuff because I ran into him at a training. So that's fun. That's kind of a funny little anecdote of that. But that student ended up excelling and didn't get in any fight, and for the most part, any trouble the whole time I had him. And then there was another student in that particular classroom. I called it one of my day ones. I literally have a comment. Give me 1 second. I can really show you. So I don't know if you can see this, but this is literally from my first day. I don't know how clearly it comes through, but from the first day of teaching, she wrote this for me, and she actually ended up becoming an author. But she talked about how she was scared on the first day, and I told her, hey, it's my first day too, and that was like, and I actually I framed that immediately. My mentor too, like that's the type of thing you frame, and I always look at. So I always have that's in my, I guess you call it my office area in my apartment. So that particular student, she actually struggled my first year with her. She still struggled most of the year. And then I got to a point in school year, we had tests, and she failed both of her tests that week. And so we were walking out to recess, and I remember she was crying, doing all this stuff. And I was like, so I'm not like that teacher. I'm not going to be like, oh, it's okay. I don't do it. So I depend on the moment. So I was like, hey, did you do the reading logs that we gave y'all? And then she was like shaking her head. So she wasn't reading at home. I was like, I don't see what you're crying for then, because you didn't do your part. So I was like, hey, cry for a little bit, and then it's time to get to work. So I told her it was okay to cry, but at this point, like, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. So she passed both of her tests that next week. And then over the summertime, because I think she didn't do as well on the start test, I think she passed one on the state assessment. And then she was reading the whole summer. That next year, she didn't fail like a test. She ended up failing like the state assessment, like by like a point. And she ended up passing on the second round, and that was the 91% I ended up getting. But that particular student, she's going on now. Her and that student, I think they're still in the same school district. She wrote a book before her 8th grade year. Wow. And Michaela Hudor, I can shout out her book. It was called The Shadow Man. So it was kind of like a horror / comedy or something like that. And I was like, what the word? This going to wrote a book already. Most people wait till the kids are like 25 and they're like, they mention them in a book or they say they did. It was like, she's already did it. And then that other student is a really good football player. Was one of the better players in his district this past school year. So just from that, as what you were saying though, like being able to show that belief in those students, because that one student, she was in the process of being put in RTI. They thought she might have been dyslexic, all this different type of stuff. And now she's writing books and actually was in AP courses in middle school. So, yes. So,
okay.
You're proud of that, Luther. Go ahead.
Of course, definitely. And you should be. And especially that you're able to make that difference in those lives in your first year of teaching while you're still in probation. So you finish up the year, then was it, because I know you've taught a range of grades. Did you jump around right away or were you at grade 4 another year?
No, I looked with that group of kids, so I did go to 5th grade. That was the only reason I stayed at that school. I didn't like how the first year went and felt like I was supported and things like that. Now that I look back, I was like, now that I'm a few years into my career, I'm like, man, I was the floor disciplinarian as a rookie teacher. That's kind of a little ridiculous. You shouldn't be the floor disciplinarian as a rookie teacher. That's kind of unfair to ask somebody to do that when you're trying to figure out, especially when you're teaching all these subjects. So I kind of thought about leaving, but I was like, I want to leave these kids. I promised them I'll show them what phenomenal look like. So I studied up all that summer, going to trainings. I think I might have had like 100 hours of professional development. Like I was a PD nut. So I went to everything. And so I came into the year just on fire. And so oddly enough, the kids actually started out very strong. Like they were doing well on assignments. They were rocking it. And then Hurricane Harvey happened. That was tough. So we had to restart the school year, essentially. That's literally what we did. We restarted the school year. And our district started earlier than others, so we essentially started at the same time everybody else did with the restart. You going with that. So I didn't like it because I was like, man, the kids were rocking it, so they were rolling. I was like, man, if they had started with that, they probably did even better than they ended up doing. But so I had to kind of rebuild the school year. Rebuild, kind of like get the routines back and, check and all that good stuff. So kids were doing well, but the class was pretty rough. Not gonna lie, that was a rough classroom. So it wasn't really about getting them there academically. It was really about holding it together. So just to kind of speed it up a little bit as far as like some of the things I dealt with this year. And I mean, it might sound like I'm almost piling on, but I am not. So in that particular school year, so the first thing that was happening is my father had a stroke that November. My father had a stroke. Then that December, one of my students' mother died. We knew I knew the previous year because she was in my classroom that her mother had terminal cancer. So we knew it was going to happen at some point. So it happened that December. And then when we came back to school, one of my students' sister died, older sister died. Then my grandmother died. Then another student's grandmother died. And then that February, another student's birth parents died. She was adopted. This is all within 3 months of each other. Like I can't even make it up. So literally all this stuff happened like right behind each other. So, cause I know one student coming and she wanted to move to a different classroom, but she said the room always seemed like sad. But I'm like, you got all these people grieving in here. Like this is some rough stuff to deal with. Like, all this in one classroom. I probably didn't get the supports I probably needed as far as, in my school I'm at now, I feel like the counselors would have rocked it. Like we had 2 counselors this past year at my school. Like I know that'd been great to have them for something like that, but I essentially had to be the counselor and the person and there for those students. And some of them dealt with it well and some did not. So it was some issues that came along with it. And then obviously I probably didn't deal with the best. I didn't miss a day of work. I literally came home from Mississippi, came home with my cousin who lived here at the time. We drove back that Sunday from the funeral, my grandmother's funeral, and I got home around 2:30 and went to work at 6:30 and just like it didn't happen. But I felt like I had to be there for my students because, all of them were dealing with things. So just throw all that in there. So it was a lot of challenges that we dealt with, and just being able to still push them and get them there academically, still very challenging. And so I was still able to, by the end of the year, I actually, 4 of my students, 5 essentially got through the process of going to the magnet school in the district, and 4 ended up, getting in through the lottery because they still had a lottery. But all of my kids that applied to the school got in. So, and that was a decent percentage, like 20% of my classroom. And then 91% passed the state assessment in reading, 64% proficient, that big, the big word. 25% masters, and I think, what was it? I actually had a pretty high number of African-American males that had, matter of fact, I think about all but one passed the state assessment. I had a couple that was masters and several that were meets. So like it was all the markers that you hear about, they hit them. So even with all of that they dealt with, they still were able to be successful. So I know I was talking to someone and said, hey man, that's your keynote. When you ever do your keynote, like that second year and what those kids were able to do and what many are them doing now. So it's other students that I've had in that classroom. It was one. So just the compilation of that classroom, I had 25% of the classroom had been put out of a school. Yeah. So you just imagine, I had one student that had been put out of 3 or 4 schools. So just imagine dealing with that. 3 of them were GT and put out of school. So just everything about the classroom was just 3 kids that were emotionally disturbed. So it was funny. Once I was talking to my best friend and he said, man, well, he's like, what is that, an alternative class? I'm like, no. So this is sad. So that's a lot, but yes.
The thing that you have to highlight is that you're teaching grade 5 students at this point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're getting a 91% proficiency, or like 91 passing with proficiency or above mm-hmm. for their reading. And if you are at the undesired school, right, and able to do this, I think that is huge kudos for you, but also recognizing people saying, oh, I can't, this is such a low achieving school, the background and like all the trauma that was experienced by those students in that year, and still being able to get the achievement that they did is what we need to celebrate and what we need to get out there, because it's saying, hey, even if you have, the kids that everybody talks about, the kids mm-hmm. you don't think are going to pass, the kids that would quote unquote fall through the cracks and people would be okay with it. You can't be, because if they have the right environment with the right teaching, they can succeed and do well. Right. So we not have this, oh, well, that's not good.
When people talk about resources too, a lot of people talk about that. And I don't think my school, like I'm in a district now, we're one of the largest school districts in America. And we have Promethean boards, and it's still districts that have projectors. Like we had like an overhead projector thing going. You still could just connect it. I never even used the document camera the whole time. I mean, we had one. I never used the document camera those 2 years. Although at my next school, they maybe it was like, we need to get you into the 21st century. But it wasn't because the kids were rough. I had to pay attention to them all the time. So anyway, like you didn't have the resources either. So it was like, I bought a lot of things. It was funny, actually, when I went to my second school, because I was so used to a lot of times when my kids needed things, whether it be like a book, a workbook or something, I a lot of times would just buy it. I wouldn't even like think nothing of it. So I went to the next school and actually bought something for one of the student parents didn't like it. She was like, hey, I can buy this stuff for him. I was like, hey, I'm just used to doing that. It wasn't like, I wasn't trying to say you don't have the money or something like that. So, and I only say the parents there didn't have the money. That's what I do. Like, I said, my kids need something, I go do it. And also, one of the things I did, I invested in my classroom library. I didn't know the district was going to give us all these books, but I actually I worked at summer school, and I ended up getting a big lump sum of money from working summer school. So part of my money went to getting a new vehicle. Because my first year, coincidentally enough, my vehicle actually got stolen. That's a story in itself. Of I would say I got my car stolen at 6:30 and got to work at 6:30. But one of the things, so yeah, I'm like that hardcore teacher. So anyway. So I invested like over $1,000 into building my classroom library because I wanted to give my kids books that they can read and things like that. So I put a heavy focus on that. So like I said, I still didn't learn because I was teaching upper grades as well. So you don't focus as much on the little smaller components of teaching reading. It's typically fluency and things like that. But also with that, and I guess some of the stuff saved for tomorrow, I did start focusing on fluency as well. Like all my kids were very fluent. I think I had a couple of kids that were reading 200 words per minute. All of them were reading like 130 words per minute, pretty much all. So that's another thing going with the NAEP scores and things like that. I didn't even realize that was like a big thing. But most of them read about 130 words per minute in 5th grade. So that was part of it as well. So it wasn't just me just motivating them. It was other stuff I was doing, but I didn't realize it because I look back at videos now, they were doing core readings. The students would be doing, I had student-led core response and things like that. I didn't realize that was super big stuff, but I was just in there teaching. And another thing I did as well, I did an article a day. I was doing that. I didn't realize, background knowledge, so it was a lot of little pieces I was doing, but I didn't realize that it was the right stuff. So it was some other little stuff going on that was high yield teaching stuff. It wasn't just engagement and make them, feel good and want to do better. I was actually teaching them the skills as well.
Wonderful. So then those first 2 years obviously had a big impact of who you are and who you became as a teacher.
Oh, for sure.
So then you mentioned that you changed to a different school. How did that transition happen? And it sounds like that school was a little bit more well off and had more resources. So how did this new experience with this new population of students?
I think it shaped me in multiple ways. I think with the students, going there, that's when I can start really focus on teaching. Because I was always putting out fires. I had kids that were rough. Kids that flipped desks, did things like that. I had kids that were rough. So they would, not all of them, some of them perfectly fine, but some of them, they had some ways about them. So you had to deal with that. So going to this school, I didn't have to parent as much. I didn't have to do as much of that type of heavy lifting. I could just go in there and teach. And I think that was great for my career as far as being able to go in there. And that's when I could start really just focusing on, for when I was departmentalized for the first time, my third year. So I was able to just focus on ELA. And I still was growing, but the kids were performing for the most part. I felt they could have did a little better. And so that was very key. But I think it was starting to be one of the more challenging times, but it's kind of twofold with that. So this is my first time kind of getting indoctrinated into the whole balanced literacy and knowing about that, because you start getting criticized, because people are like, hey, mind you, I'm getting to the 85-90% of my kids are passing tests. And actually they were doing better in writing. I'm a stronger writing teacher. I always tell people that I'm actually a stronger writing teacher. So you getting criticized, your kids are outperforming other people. And one of the teachers on my grade level, she actually was a literacy coach for like 15 years. So I'm outperforming her too. So, and then they're like, oh, you didn't do more groups. I'm like, well, what are you talking about? Because it was confusing to me. And I probably didn't know how to articulate it at the time, because I probably didn't know what they were talking about to that level, because I didn't know about the different structures of teaching reading. So I'm like, what are you talking about? I do RTI. And then I had tutoring groups after school. So I'm like, I do groups. What are you talking about? But I didn't know you do some little mini lesson and get into small groups, which if I was told that at the time, I'd have been like, heck to the no. So I thought it was stupid. So even still to this day. Now, so that was kind of challenging. But one of the things it did do, because I always tell people, like, I don't know how much you're into sports. I'm very much like a Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant in that mindset. If you do something like that, I will learn something just to troll you almost. Like, I was like, okay, you want to say I don't know what I'm doing, or this or that, so I'm going to learn all I need to learn. So that's when I started learning about the theories and all this different type of stuff. Talking to my sister. My sister's actually a balanced literacy teacher. Now, a funny little anecdote, I actually texted my sister that my district was moving toward structured literacy, and she didn't respond to the text. So that's how she says it, balanced literacy. So anyway, she might listen to this now. Okay, but that was kind of so in a way, it was tough to deal with, because it probably wasn't the healthiest environment. But at the same time, it kind of made me kind of want to learn more about this reading stuff and learn about all these different theories. Because I was like, I want to see what this person's talking about. And that's probably led to my fourth year where, so I taught fourth grade that third year. The next year, I actually bumped down to second grade, which I did not want to do. But one thing I told somebody straight up, I was like, when I knew, because I was trying to get out of work in second grade, I was like, hey, put me on field, put me on fourth, put me somewhere, just not second. And eventually what I was going to have to work. And I told somebody, hey, I'm not going to suck. So that's kind of where I got to the point where I was like, okay, I got to learn this stuff. And then I had a student that couldn't decode or encode a word. And I think I mentioned before when we were talking, that his mother dealt with severe dyslexia and had to go to a special school. So he was obviously dyslexic. He can go all the testing, but he's in second grade. He can't decode or spell a word. The writing was not there, obviously. Comprehension was high, very high. He can talk to you for days, but his mom was severely dyslexic, and there was a heavy family history of it. So that's what it was. They could have went to a year of testing, but so my thing was, I'm like, okay, I got to figure this out. I'm not finna wait for some year of testing and some lady come pull him for 30 minutes and no, I'm finna figure this out. So I did. I still probably didn't know about scope and sequences and things like that when it came to teaching literacy, but I came up with my word study program, which I've expanded now and do more of and presented and done all type of stuff with. So that's when I kind of, that journey as a teacher, that's when I kind of really started learning how to teach reading. That was probably, I always say, look, one thing about me, I'm hyper competitive. As you heard me talking about test performance, I'm hyper competitive when it comes to numbers. And one of my friends even opined about me going back to the classroom. It's like, yeah, you probably missed that classroom stuff because you like kind of the competitive aspect of it. And I'm like, yeah, you're probably right. So that was the toughest part about working second grade, but that just so happened to be the same year of COVID. I was like, yeah, that's kind of the perfect year for that to happen because we don't have any state tests anyway. So that was the perfect year for me to work second grade. But that's when I started really learning how to teach and knowing what I was doing. Because I was in there doing cool stuff, but I didn't know why I was right, except for a few things. But that's when I learned how to teach. But professionally, it wasn't the best environment for me to grow. One, being an African-American male, some of it just methods of what they wanted to use. It was not a healthy environment. So it shaped me in multiple ways, but I feel like everything has its reason and has its purpose because two other things that is a big shaper of my career. I didn't have the best relationship with my mother growing up. And then at the same time, because of that, I spent a lot of my adulthood, because I didn't start teaching as a classroom teacher until I was 31. I spent about 10, 11 years of my adulthood not really excelling and doing well. Because, I was a gifted kid growing up. I should have been making straight A's, all this stuff in college, and I didn't. And I was like, that time I spent kind of wasting, and I write reflections. My very first reflection is don't waste time. So that's why it seems like it's an internal clock and I want to learn. I want to do this because I spent years not doing it and not taking things seriously. So I take teaching very seriously. And I also very much so advocate for my kids. So even at my first school, one of the things, my vehicle got stolen at 6:30. I showed up to work at 6:30 the next day. 6:30 in the evening, showed up at work at 6:30. Got in a car wreck before I came to school. I was with my mom, and I was adamant about making it to school on time for my kids' awards day program. I was adamant because I remember my mom missed one of mine when I was in 7th grade. I was like, I'm not gonna miss this. So I got to school on time for that. So I didn't miss a day. I essentially missed a day of school until this year. And this is my 7th year of teaching. So I never missed a day. So that's why it seems like I have that insane drive, because I missed a lot of times, because there are a lot of people that think I'm actually a more experienced teacher than I am. One, I started older, but also because I've learned, I put so much time into the craft that even at year 3 or 4, I know at year 4, one of the coaches said she was surprised that I was a 4th-year teacher. She said it seemed like I was more seasoned than that, but that's because of some of the people I around. Because in my first 4 years of teaching, I had like 300 hours of professional development. So, and that's just beside the other stuff that I do. So I take it that serious. So, all these things are kind of like shaped my career.
Well, and you're not one of those teachers that is there and coasts. Mm-hmm. You don't find your groove and just keep on going. You strive for more, you strive for better, and you're not going to accept the status quo.
Now, of course, that gets you in trouble, but.
So we talked about the first 4 years. Then it's COVID. Mm. And how did that change how you were teaching, how you were learning, and what you were able to do?
So really, most of that next year, I didn't even teach. Because of that experience, I kind of took most of that next year. I didn't even teach. And it led to the point where I started the phenomenal student. But actually, I was viewed myself as a teacher, though. So a lot of you probably sometimes see on my Facebook, that stuff will pop up and I'll see like I was studying, I was researching. That's when I did a lot of my researching that year. I was researching, building a lot of the routines that I have, structures. So I was building up a lot of that stuff during that time. So I did a lot of studying during that time. So I wasn't officially teaching. I probably was acting more like a consultant or someone like that would act, as far as like I really was studying my craft. Like teaching, of course, you're honing your craft, but studying, is a different thing. You're learning to research and it's boring stuff, but all research has little nuggets of things. Because I'm not the type of person that just reads research like, oh, that sounds cool. I'm like, no, I might look at it and be like, okay, I need to try this. Okay, summarization is a high effect size. I need to focus more on that. Curiosity is a high effect size. I need to focus on that. So as I'm reading this research, some of it to see what I can change about some of my structures or what part of it works and why does it work. Because even those first 4 years, I was doing cool stuff, but I really didn't know the why to it and why was the right thing to do. And then what was I doing that was ineffective? For the most part, I think I did mostly effective things, but there may have been some stuff you were doing like, why are you doing this? So that was a lot of what I did during that time. So I actually ended up working at a charter school the last couple months of the school year and had a huge impact on just their overall performance, because they went from 20% of the kids passing tests. So they were kind of down pretty much to about 60%, over 60%, right around 60% of them. Or I think right at 60% of them passed that state assessment that year. And so they made a 40% jump. And then this is in 3 months. And then using some of the methods that I use. And apparently I was talking to a lady that was over the school, and she said that the next year they actually, they kept doing well. So it stuck. So that kind of gave me a bug, like, okay, you can do this. But one of my things that kind of, the decision I made to become an interventionist, I guess I'm going back to the classroom now, but I spent the last few years as an interventionist, is mainly because of the balanced literacy thing here in Houston at that time. And it's changing now, wholesale for the most part. But a lot of the districts very much believed in balanced literacy. I was like, okay, you ran into issues at this place because of balanced literacy. It's like, if you're an interventionist, like, I was like, I had a conversation really with myself, like, would you be willing to be an interventionist? Because then you could do a little more, you can maybe do some stuff, and then maybe when things change, boom, you can go back. Because at that time, I still looked at myself as a classroom teacher. I wasn't looking at doing interventions or anything like that. But I decided to apply for an interventionist job, and my principal hired me. So my data was really good. I mean, I've had, outside of even, I didn't talk about the growth metrics at the other school, but in my first school, obviously I got 91%. And here's the fun fact. That's the last full year of teaching with one group of kids that I have had. That's one of the reasons I'm going back to the classroom. Because my third year, I got switched after the third 9 weeks. Mind you, they was criticizing my methods, but at the same time, I moved the kids very fast. Most of the kids, 83% of the kids met their growth measure by the middle of the year. End of the year growth measure by the middle of the year. And they were doing pretty well. So I was like, hey, he moves kids pretty fast. Why don't we just move him for the fourth 9 weeks and give somebody else his kids, and then we'll, give him that teacher his performance, and maybe he can boost the other kids. So, that was my reward for doing an excellent job. So, okay. And then even that fourth, when I taught second grade, that was my first year teaching second grade. I had 2 students that ended the year at a T. I know reading levels is kind of a thing, but they ended the year at a T. Half of my classroom ended the year above level. We did CPRI, and a lot of the students grew exponentially there. And then according to math, we didn't do it at the end of the year, but they did it at the beginning of the year, and I still had access. They actually grew 2.4 years in vocabulary and 2.0 years in reading. So they grew astronomically in just that second. And this is with COVID going on that last 9 weeks. So even though I still met with them over Zoom and things like that, I mean, I only imagine what I could have did if I could have had that other 9 weeks to really work with them. So that was that.
So with grade 2 students, and was this considered like an at-risk school? Or
no, they weren't at risk. Like, they weren't at all.
Okay, but
it's
still,
probably middle class.
Getting 2.4 years of growth in their vocabulary is amazing, because what we have to recognize is when it comes to we're not explicitly teaching the vocabulary that they need, right? There's no way we could possibly do it. So just through the way that you are engaging with the students, the material that you are giving them, the guidance you are giving them as you are teaching them to read in grade 2, where they're still focusing on learning to read, not reading to learn, they are able to expand and grow their vocabulary dramatically. And that's going to help them long-term with comprehension, right?
A lot of them are still questioning. Well, and I would say, because I came from upper grade, my go-to was rigor. So rigor and comprehension. So I did explicitly, ironically, our phonics curriculum at that time, what we're supposed to use for that 30 minutes doing that little block, because they did have a block for like word study was the units of study phonics. And I was like, this is not going to get it, because I had a kid that was dyslexic, like this isn't going to get it. And that's when I created my word study process called Word Power. And that's when I started doing that. And so that's kind of, and honestly, I've enhanced it so much since then. So that I do feel like that probably played a larger role. Also, I engaged in a lot of class discussions. I mean, I had a lot of kids that weren't great readers. I actually had one kid that had the lowest reading level, but he was GT. So, I mean, I can show you some videos of like the class discussion. It was off the charts. So I used a lot of my higher kids or stronger kids. I don't like using high, medium, low for the most part, but at the same time, they were pulling up some of the other kids through that class discussion, even with, so I used Bloom's. And I was upgrading the rigor. I had kids that could give you 2 forms of evidence for theme. They were doing crazy stuff. I mean, I always told people my second classroom, even though they were my roughest, I never thought I would have another classroom that would rival them. And so I had them little second graders just to show you the level of some of those kids. One of my kids, and there's one video I actually posted on social media, but this one kid, I read from mother to son the first week. And I was just trying to see how they would respond to it or what they would say. And I read the poem, and I was like, what is, the poem about, or something to that level. And one of my students was like, sound like his mom had a rough life. I was like, I know you did not. I was like, wow. And then there's another video I put on social media with this one student, and he gave the most brilliant response to the character Thoughts Change. Like, they were doing this wicked stuff, and he would use words like nocturnal animals, and like that. Them kids were amazing. And so I felt like it was my most successful year academically, and I learned so much. Pretty much 90% of the routines, 80 to 90% of the routines that I use now and came up with, that was the year I started doing them. Because those kids could go with anything. And I had their trust. I still remember when I started using this intervention structure I call TIDE, it's like a 5-part intervention structure. The kids, so when they started it doing their RTI, and I would go like, it's TIDE time. And then there was one day, one of the kids like, hey, we hadn't said TIDE time yet or something like that. I was like, oh, wow. So it was kind of like that type of thing. They really got into it. They loved it. So that they were willing to work. This is a second grade classroom at that. So that was one of my biggest worries, that it was second graders. They wouldn't want to work hard, but they wanted it. They wanted to work hard.
Wonderful. So now let's jump ahead to what you've been doing over the past year. And what exactly Phenomenal Student is. In our next episode, we're going to go into more detail about exactly how it's done. But if we just talk about how you got there. It sounds like COVID.
Yeah, so I developed it all during COVID, and obviously as an interventionist. And so obviously I developed this resource called the Playbook and like my overall intervention structure. And the district I'm in, for the last 2 years, they have been balanced literacy. So I know I told you, I was like, hey, you can do interventions. Like, they don't do none of that balanced literacy stuff in interventions. And I soon found out that wasn't the case. You hear words like LLI, guided reading. I'm like, what, and what? But I was kind of allowed to because my numbers were pretty good. So I was kind of allowed a little autonomy to kind of do some things. Everybody wasn't happy about it, but I was allowed a little autonomy. So I was able to grow kids. We focused on reading levels my first year, and I was able to use some of those structured literacy methods to grow my kids pretty, fast. The first semester was kind of clunky because I was kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out, because I still was teaching half the day. And then the other half I was intervening. So I kind of wasn't like locked in the way I should have been, because I'm a classroom teacher at heart. So I was more locked in the classroom. Intervention was kind of like just something I did in the evening time, to be honest with you. But once the middle of the year hit, I kind of dove in and the kids started moving. I mean, with my intervention structure, I was saying after kids get to a certain point, I'm going to move them a level per 2 weeks, according to the structure, somewhere pretty close. And, a few people scoffed at it. They're like, that's not going to happen. And I was like, okay, again, I'm the type of person, tell me what I can't do, I will do it. So I actually started doing it with certain kids that went from K's to O's in like 8 weeks. Like, that's how fast they move. Like, it stuck too, because even going into the next year, those kids were those reading levels, so they didn't fall behind. So a lot of my methods, so that was kind of, like I said, we're going to get more in detail tomorrow, but one of the things I try to do with my methods, and even as you can see with those second graders, they did it at the beginning of the year, the next year, is a lot of the things I do, they get some mastery. And whether it's in phonics, word study, with vocabulary, I feel that's kind of a thing that you're there, you're not there. That's not like you lose it. And then comprehension, whatever I teach them, it sticks. Mm-hmm. So whatever level you get to, it sticks. So a lot of those methods, were able to stick. And I was even as an interventionist, I kind of have a relationship-driven approach. A lot of the kids wanted to come to intervention. It wasn't like, some man pulling them out and doing 30 minutes of this. They actually wanted to work with Mr. Short. Like, even as an interventionist, I'm literally the most popular teacher in the building. That's not me being braggadocious or anything. I'm literally the most popular teacher in the building. So pre-K kids know who I am, literally. So going into this particular year, last year, I've kind of really started to be able to expand, obviously, be able to interview with people like yourself. This is, I think, probably like my 4th interview. And then just being able to really put my ideas out there now. And then this year was kind of clunky, a lot with our intervention. That was one of my frustrations and one of the reasons I'm going back to the classroom. But I still was able to move kids because we did use math, we did use M-Class, we used more data-based methods, although we still had reading levels. So I still was able to move kids and then grow them according to math and according to their reading level. Although it wasn't to my liking, they still were able to grow a lot. And I'm very proud of that, but I'm actually very excited to go back to the classroom. I actually told people I feel like I got my superpowers back because I haven't taught from bell to bell the same group of kids without disruption since my 2nd year. Technically, I did it my 4th year with the 2nd graders, but we had COVID. And then my 3rd year, I got switched before the 4th 9 weeks. So I'm excited kind of to have the same group the whole year, because I've been able to move kids in half a year, and even in intervention, I just imagine, I literally was planning before we got on the interview, what I can do if I had a whole year, even though I'm gonna be self-contained. So I'm gonna be teaching everything, which I've done before, but I'm excited to see what I can do if I had a group of kids from the beginning of the year, get that action research, and then what I can do at the end, by the end of the year. And then you can put that information out there.
Of course. Well, that's amazing. And I can't wait to learn more about what you're doing in your class tomorrow, in our next lesson. So thank you so much for joining me today. And we will, hold on. Sorry, press the wrong button. We will talk again soon.